Rhiannon Zweig is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota in Writing Studies, Rhetoric, and Technical Communication program. Their research prioritizes the intersections of queer and feminist rhetorics, theories, and pedagogies.
Hi guys, thank you. So funnily enough, we're going to be discussing a very similar archival issue. And I don't have slides, so you guys get to just listen to me. I'm so sorry. In the heart of Florida's capital, Florida State University boasts an impressive special collections and archives. Dirac's papers, an extensive Napoleon collection, the Marcia Gontarski Children's Literature Collection populate the database. It is an archive compiled with care and curiosity, and I can speak from experience that the individuals steering this ship are doing all they can in order to authentically and equitably curate the stacks. Why then does the Naiad Press collection remain uncatalogued? What was available, the oral history collection, taken down and only accessible when physically in the walls of the archive? What disparate messages are being procured when housing a large collection of Naiad Press texts and ephemera and yet making them inaccessible? Queer archival practices are painfully nuanced and must be delicately navigated. Reparative, respectful, and perversely presentist metadata in cataloging is paramount. Now, more than ever, researchers and readers are owed a transparent and reflective catalog. We are facing an era of censorship that seeks to further ostracize queer histories and understandings. Archives are faced, as such, with the tribulation of providing many different spaces, research and reading rooms, digital labs often, and various workshops and special classes shape the daily flow of the archives. Following the examples of scholars spanning from the 90s to more recent publications, the manifestations of queer archives have been complicated. Sourcing responsibly and creating equitable archival practices lays imperative groundwork for authentic collections. Navigating access to these archives is a different thing altogether. In Race, Rhetoric, and Technology, Adam Banks provides a helpful framework to decode layers and the realities of access. For Banks, this is a four-tiered paradigm made of material, functional, experiential, and critical accesses. While Banks is a technical communicator, and this section specifically responds to his concept of the digital divide, and it's great, really good book. This framework of access is helpful to consider when grappling with issues of archival holdings, cataloging, and retrievals. Briefly, material access relies on being able to use the technology and, quote, begins with equality in the material conditions that drive use or non-use, end quote. Functional access describes a legitimate and effective use of the technology, which Banks connects to functional literacy, where, quote, it is insufficient for economic or political power or for many kinds of participation in the nation's social or cultural structures, end quote, alone. Functional access and literacy, then, cannot be where the buck stops. Experiential access requires repeated use, which becomes relevant to the user's life. Critical access asks users to critically inspect the ways in which they use and further rely upon technologies, and we're going to include text in the technology. Florida State University is troubled by a specific issue. Governor Ron DeSantis is breathing down the campus's neck. This poses a real danger, but is emboldened by systemic and institutionalized acceptance. We breathe life into hegemonic control by fearing the power it represents. Where do we draw the line between diplomatically resisting and bowing our heads to allow for censorship? Are the archives of a public university the best place for an archive of this variety, or can we better provide access and futurity through other means of archival practices? It is no secret that DeSantis poses a real danger to higher education. I watched my professors as they sought out ways to, around his list of banned words, protested alongside Alachua County teachers and parents during periods of accentuated overreach, and there's one happening now, over an elementary school's teacher's honorific, and watched in horror as New College was gutted, a grim foreshadowing of the state's education system writ large. I will not pretend that the growing control exerted over public institutions, specifically those where a so-called liberal agenda might be espoused, has dangerous and very real ramifications. I do not mean to imply that the only option the Naiad Press collection has is for Florida State to immediately catalog and promote their holdings. As I said, queer archival practices require nuance. Despite my issue with the delayed cataloging, I understand why there may be hesitation now. I personally disagree with it, but I don't receive funding directly from the state of Florida. It is necessary to preserve academic spaces like the archive, but these spaces are less effective when they do not continue to meet the demands of students. As we have watched the current administrations in Tallahassee and Washington, D.C. develop, queer communities online and on the ground alike have responded in outrage. Only a decade has passed since the hard-fought victory for marriage equality. and politicians and the public have repeatedly called for the overturn of Obergefell v. Hodge. Drag queens, non-binary educators, gender-neutral bathrooms, and hormone replacement therapy have received scrutiny and increased ramifications. Online and in-person threats, doxing, and other violent repercussions have dotted news feeds as the American right grows more virulent. All this and these issues only interrogate dominant forms of queerness. Read white, upper-class, cisgendered, and primarily gay men. Despite this, online activism continues to direct queer individuals towards seeking assimilation and recognition within the very institutions which hope to undermine marginalized livelihood. Here, I am petitioning for a return to the grassroots and mobilized activism found in the second half of the 20th century. It was those punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens which taught the queer community to riot. It is this amalgamation of identities that hope to remind us to look for validation, history, and community beyond the scope of the academy. As it stands, university archives and special collections have preserved and protected important pieces of some queer history, typically within the halls of an unqueer institution. To be unqueer is more than simply housing normative identities. It is a participation in repeated acts of erasure and prioritization of cis and heteronormative identities. It is desperately important to preserve and disperse our queer histories. It is equally as important to cultivate spaces where these histories, identities, political bodies, and experiences are uplifted and prized. This paper begins to navigate this blurry line. The Academy houses our canonical texts and histories while concurrently reifying the dominant ideation and expectation of normativity. We are walking the path our queer ancestors tramped for us. Honoring the tradition of grassroots action and community knowledge building is necessary. The Academy and her archives are far from the only way we preserve our history. They serve as template and warning in the same breath. Naiad Press opened its doors in 1973 when the women in print movement, the lesbian feminist and lesbian separatist movements, and the broader women's liberation movement were all thriving. Naiad was not the first lesbian feminist press, and it came of age in an era where there were a number of dedicated bookstores, periodical journals, and printing houses. It is natural to assume that these movements and spaces thrived exclusively in larger cities. San Francisco, New York, and Portland certainly house, and still house, organizations within the zeitgeist. We can contribute part of this to a simple numbers game. There were more citizens of these cities, therefore a higher density of out lesbians and active feminists. As such, establishing community spaces was easier to facilitate. To assume these are the only cities and communities, however, does organizations on the geological outskirts a disservice. Naiad Press was one of these organizations. The women in print movement heavily focused itself on creating an alternate route of communication. If anybody has studied history of text technologies, you might be familiar with Adam and Barker's communication circuit model from a new model for the study of the book, published in 1993. For those of us who have not engaged with this text, a communication circuit draws a lines between every step of the publishing and distribution process. Adam and Barker specifically focused on the sheer number of people involved in early printing and publishing, and specifically the shippers themselves, as they were the carriers of the text from printer to bookseller. Drawing from this idea, Tris Travis posits that the women in print movement sought to establish an alternate communication circuit in her article, The Women in Print Movement, Histories and Implications. When the first women-owned and operated presses and journals began to crop up, women could not so much as open a bank account or a credit card in their own name. It was a beyond male-dominated era and time, and publishing was not spared from this divide. Long before this particular movement, authors were discussing the difficulty of navigating writing and womanhood. Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. Of course, we can acknowledge the distasteful amount of prejudice that would motivate the assertion that there would just be more women writing if they were good at it, because it's easier to say that if only women were actually good at writing, there would be a greater number of successful authors than it is to acknowledge longstanding barriers upheld by the patriarchal cycles. To create an alternative communication circuit, the women in print movement relied on the entirety of the community, primarily booksellers, who were often called bookwomen or bookwoman, spelled book W-O-M-O-N, which I think is super fun, cultivated means of reaching out to others. Notably, Carol C.J. and Andre quarterly published the Feminist Bookstore newsletter, which later became the Feminist Bookstore News. They specifically circulated this newsletter to women-owned, operated, and serving bookstores as a way to distribute book lists, events, and organizing ideas. They ultimately expanded to include feminist publishers, Naiad Press included, after deliberating the benefits of including these organizations that they were trying to influence through tactics shared in Feminist Bookstore News. There are also some really fun letters to the editor where there's like a bunch of sassy exchanges between Barbara Greer, the founder, or one of the founders, and some of their authors. It's silly. This periodical and others like it were an opportunity to circulate information and, by extension, provided a means of cultivating community. The Feminist Bookstore News founders organized conferences dedicated to issues in publishing and feminism, sought out grassroots organizations and communities who centered similar belief in political systems, and ultimately influenced dozens of presses, bookstores, and bookwomen. If we imagine this communication circuit, it might look something like this: author to lesbian feminist press, where every step of the bookmaking occurs, to a mail order catalog, to FBN, Feminist Bookstore News, my bad, and other periodicals for book lists, to lesbian feminist bookstores, back to those periodicals with reviews to the public readers, who then ultimately respond to the author. On and on it goes, with an emphasis on the community. If we fast forward in time to 2021, Dr. Michael Franklin and a team of his students began an oral history project dedicated to Naiad Press. These interviews, historic contextualizations, and some incredible photographs are compiled on a Florida State University hosted and built website. Florida State University's Museum of Fine Arts hosted an exhibit the following year featuring ephemera in San Francisco's public library's holding and a roundtable panel with Joe Nessel, Catherine V. Forrest, Cheryl Clark, and other well-known lesbian feminist writers. This is a valuable resource, especially considering the oral histories recorded feature community members who were not involved in the logistics of Naiad Press itself. They were just around, oftentimes at the softball games. In Dr. Franklin's project, we get to know people who were in Tallahassee during Naiad Press's time. As I mentioned before, the San Francisco Public Library has an impressive holding of Naiad Press, as do Cornell and Texas A&M universities. The Lesbian Herstory Archive houses an impressive collection which provides helpful context to the era and communities, but there wasn't anything more specific on Naiad Press collection there unless you went, which is an access issue. All this to say, the historic lesbian feminist press, which the Tallahassee Democrat frequently called Tallahassee's very own, has a negligible amount of accessible artifacts within the city limits, or even within a day's road trip. This is an archival silence of a different variety. The history is there, and it is tangible. It was simply deliberately displaced by the founders of Naiad Press. While I can understand the inclination to shepherd valuable ephemera to a safer place, it diametrically opposed the repeated attitude of Naiad Press during their operational years. In interviews, specifically on television, Greer stated that she refused to let the pressure of conservative views influence the operations of the press. While it would be a typically fair assumption that Greer and McBride's donation began after Naiad closed its doors, this is not the case. Greer established the San Francisco Public Library's collection in 1992 and completed it in 1998. Naiad Press shuttered in 2001, just about a decade after the collection began. Not only was the history displaced, it barely had time to rest in the South. The current status of the Naiad Press collection at Florida State serves as a reincarnated reminder of this displacement. Even when there is the opportunity for these texts to be accessible within the city, it remains locked away. Isn't this the cruel joke of an unqueer institution? The promise of inclusion, if only we are patient enough and accept scraps in the meanwhile. This paper has posed many questions, and I hate to admit that I'm not sure I can answer them, not singularly at least. At the heart of my concern is community, and as such, this project requires community answers. We have helpful frameworks in this process, reaching as far back as Kathy J. Cohen's 1997 Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, The Radical Potential of Queer Politics, ? And Jack Halberstam's 2005 book, In a Queer Time and Place, and picking up as recently as 2 years ago with Maria Paz Carvajal, Redidors, chapter in Unsettling Archival Research. Queer archival practices are not a new concept. The Lesbian Herstory Archives were founded in 1972, a year before Naiad Press. But here I assert that we can collect these varied ideas and forge a way to bring necessary queer history back into the hands of those who seek it. We return to our borrowed technical communication framework. Our history is vital, but it is most useful when we can see, touch, interrogate, and interact with its artifacts. Without the opportunity to interact with the lesbian detective erotica Naiad published prolifically, specifically from the late 70s to the early 90s, readers lose the opportunity to critically examine the development of pulp fiction and the lesbian addition to the genre. This critical access is even more important when considering the position of Barbara Greer, one of the founders and most frequently name-dropped of Naiad Press, and her connection to the latter and the Daughters of Bilitis. This is the first lesbian organization in the United States and the first lesbian publication. And they didn't solely publish erotic and erotica adjacent texts. However, many of the early lesbian writers for the latter cite pulp fiction and erotica as their first look into the lesbian community and lesbian possibilities. In sequestering the later texts, such as Naiad's corpus of work, these lesbian histories are shortened, brought to an early grave with the implication that such subaltern embodiments and stories could not have happened towards the latter half of the 20th century. An impasse. Archiving queerness, queering the archive, in a way that is critical, equitable, reparative, and respective. In her 2017 article, A Queered Archival Methodology, Archival Bodies as Nomadic Subjects, Jamie Ann Lee theorizes the embodied and nomadic ways in which the archive and the queer can be approached. Here, quote, the archives become queer or not, as it works to hold and preserve shifting histories and shifting experiences, end quote, and its holdings become, quote, stories so far. This dynamic framework informs the queered archival methodology that I have developed in order to be attentive to bodies in motion, archival and otherwise, and nomadic subjectivities. I mentioned Halberstam and Cohen earlier. A Queer Time and Place is, of course, a cornerstone of queer theory, and for a reading pairing, I would highly suggest pairing the Brandon Archive chapter with Divine's Cut, Public Memory, and the Politics of Martyrdom by C. Norton Riley. They're each grappling with the murder of Brandon Tina, Lisa Lambert, and Philip Divine in Nebraska. In the final chapter, What's That Smell?, Halberstam lays out an important note for queer archival practices. Quote, minority subcultures in general tend to be documented by former or current members of the subculture rather than by adult experts. Nonetheless, queer subcultures in particular are often marked by this lack of distinction between the archivist and the cultural worker, end quote. One of the earlier pieces structuring queer archives, there is an implicit understanding of queer positionality, one outside of the institutions, directed by those living and creating within the queer community. It is this energy that may have directed Carol, CJ, and Andre to begin circulating feminist bookstore news all those years ago. The institutionalized overlook of queer bodies, experiences, and text placed the burden of proof, I'm here, onto the community itself. In order to preserve these stories so far and the body as archive, queer authors and readers are responsible for finding the means of doing so. When they succeeded, they thrived. The Lesbian History Archives is one of a few examples. Further, we can look into Cohen's 1997 Punks to provide an early framework and the concerns which informed it. In the opening paragraphs of the piece, Cohen places herself oppositionally to a palatable form of queer politics and the hegemonic examples which laid the path. Quote, in queer theorizing, the sexual subject is understood to be constructed and contained by multiple practices of categorization and regulation, the varying degrees and multiple sites of power distributed within all categories, end quote. Simply put, Cohen wishes we did more done differently. While I will posit that we have only done less as a phenomenon of social media activism has replaced a functional knowledge of organization on a broad scale, the remainder of that is not within the scope of the paper. The queer politics that Cohen opposes leads to the belief that marriage equality was, at least on the large scale, enough. We didn't have to fight with the same virulence because the nationally recognized and enforced right proved that we were on similar ground to the cisgendered or heterosexual marriages that were naturalized hundreds of years ago. Oh, how quickly the tables turned. Returning to Lee's queered archival methodology, she asserts that, quote, the archives as queered are, importantly, those spaces that are committed to deploying queer as a practice and a politics to work on and within the archives as an active intervention, end quote. As we watch the current political leaders strip queer bodies, texts, and possibilities away in every way they can, it is important to remember the options we have available. As I said earlier, I do not blame the archivists for hesitating to catalog these texts now. It is a slippery slope these days, and the weaponization of monetary support is a real and present danger for students, faculty members, and departments alike. This does not negate the importance of these materials' breathing room. Although I hesitate to propose dichotomies, this is where we can observe the difference between a queer and unqueer institution. Despite the best intentions of the archival team at Florida State, they are beholden to the permissions and support of the university's president, the Board of Governors, and Governor Ron DeSantis. The chain of command can and does complicate the process of queering subjects. Preserving queer history, especially something as uniquely tangible as a collection of rare books, challenges the limitations of the university's archives. Although they can technically maintain and care for these texts and ephemera, the queer methodology which Lee theorizes is supported by different means of accessing these texts, in turn specifically focusing on Banks's last two types of access. Instead, these texts may better serve our community in a community archive. Who would have guessed? We're familiar now with different means of access, and we can situate the history of Naiad Press within its temporality and our own. Now, we must move forward to create an archive which offers us a means of utilizing these resources. Digital archives are helpful, but subject to various issues of access depending on when, how, and who creates them. Physical archives, university and otherwise, present the issue of accessibility as well. How do we move forward and ensure that our history is reachable? Can we? Thank you.
Thank you. No, that was, and there were so many overlaps. That was so fun.
Yeah, that was fun.
All right, we'll open it up to questions if anyone has any or comments. Okay, your hand first. Yeah.
Oh, I actually have a question for both of you.
Okay.
I'm wondering how you think, like bringing up queer historical materials right now, do you think that if that stuff was to become like mainstream or whatever, and people were faced with it, would it actually like halt the accusations of queer being like a new thing, or do you think they would just like find another way to invalidate it? Does that make sense?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, you take that first.
Cool. So I think part of why I will like continue to assert that we need to have these is less for like disproving accusations from people who are homophobic and more for giving queer people the resources. I think one of the most effective things that the like censorship does is insulate us and make us feel like it's new. And so like as much as I will always like stand up, yell, and be like, no, you mother freaker, you don't get to be mean to me because I'm gay. It's also to like turn around to like the 16-year-old and be like, hey, look, we were here and we made it this far, and they were doing this cool work then, and it's important to know. I do think it also like has the opportunity, they're always gonna have the opportunity to like be like, well, this is bad and whatever, and they do that, and I tend to not give it weight, because why reify it?
Yeah, I think that, sorry, could you say your question again for me?
I was wondering, sorry, I was trying to find a way to word it, but also listen. So I was like, I worded it kind of weird, but I was wondering about like maybe the invalidation aspect of like burying these texts and how them resurfacing right now, like how that would maybe change or not change, or maybe make people like double down against human rights. Does that make some more sense?
Yeah, I mean, the question, your question makes me think of like the like organizational like politics of speech acts, right? Like writing texts are presumably a legal speech act. They fall under that kind of category, and they seek for that kind of protection. And so in like making these speech acts public, I think like there can be that kind of like tendency for them to be like weaponized, right? And you know, these materials are like sensitive. I oftentimes wonder like what a public would do with these, because a lot of these could be considered obscene today. Like child porn is rampant throughout these, and that's kind of the like only obscenity charge you'll see these days, except for the occasional like outlier. And so yeah, I mean, I think there's totally like fear with the ephemera, but at the same time, like these really are some of the earliest like gay writings. I mean, there's obviously exceptions. The Harlem Renaissance stands out as one of them. So I think like, sure, they could be used that way, but also I think thinking about like, I think about obscenity in kind of the canon formation a lot, and what texts are left out in kind of the 50s and 60s. In queer lit, right? Like we get Baldwin, we get Ginsberg, we get Howell, but a lot of these texts are left out. So I think, you know, like using like our disciplinary tools and like the institutional tools that we have are also important, and kind of bringing these archives to light for not just like general publics, but also our discipline, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have like a bunch of stuff. The first, I want to say a comment that I find it really interesting that there's that like obscenity has almost like changed form slightly in the form of like banned books and banned words. And so it's interesting when people say that there are more rights and more liberties. It's just that like the language is just getting sneakier, and like obviously it's not just queer language, it's also language about race and like sexuality, other issues.
Well, if you look at like the queer organizing, right, the appeals to kind of the 14th Amendment have been generally successful as of late, right? We have Obergefell, like you mentioned, Lawrence, and recently, right, Bostock in 2020, which was when they ruled that gender identity and sexual orientation, right, are discrimination against those, are also sex-based discrimination, which was like huge. And what we're seeing now is that the First Amendment as a whole is the strategy through which polls are being poked through that specifically, right? And so I think obscenity like is relevant today because it's like kind of the like key in which we're responding to, right? In the Bostock decision, Alito says, you know, if I have to honor somebody's pronouns, that's a restriction of my freedom of speech. The conversion therapy bans, right? We're about to see those go most likely. We don't know yet. And so you're right, like appealing like to like class identifications for queers and like rights to that has been successful, but at the same time, right, like the First Amendment is kind of where we're seeing the key tool to like undermine that and poke holes in that. So I do think that somewhere there's got to be a new strategy for this.
Well, I was actually thinking too, I know that there's like a rising lens of like queering the movement, like unassimilating in order to like find new modes of being and identifying and stuff. And so yeah, like I'm specifically calling back like the Queer Art of Failure by Jack Halberstam. He talks about like undoing oneself in order to find new ways and failing under like the dominant society.
Yeah.
I guess like capitalistically, socially. So I just think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I talk about this later in my dissertation project. In the 70s, I follow a group of underground cartoonists who are doing those exact moves, right? They're not, what Womack is doing here in this paper is very much like a normative project, and I try to make that clear, right? Ultimately, what he's trying to do is make money, but in that kind of way of marketing these texts, he's like producing this capitalist fantasy of gay identity that is like very normative. If you actually read some of the stories, they all end in like marriages or whatever, right? It's kind of these world building projects, but yeah, so this, I would say that this paper is very much a part of like the homophile politics. It's very like white, upper class, and it's kind of appealing to like, you know, assimilating the norms, like we're okay, we're not a threat. But there are other strategies. I would also point to Eric Stanley's book on becoming ungovernable, right, and the whole like whether or not like we can opt out as well. So you're right, there definitely are strategies for that. This paper though is not, at least this press that I'm highlighting, that is not their strategy.
Right.
They're very much interested in like, I want to be a citizen, I want to be like normative. So.
And that sits right in the middle too, where they're like, we're gonna republish these, like they did a whole collection of, they called them volume books, and they pulled out like pulp from the 50s and repackaged it, and some of them are like super cool and still like very erotic, and some of them are less so.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if this completely goes with where you were researching, Ryan, and excuse me, but when you were talking about early book houses and presses,
Yes.
Amazon came to mind in Minneapolis,
Yes.
And also in Gainesville.
Iris.
Thank you.
Yep.
Both of which
Are closed.
are gone.
Yes.
I think the legacy of Amazon Chrysalis is still open in
Yes.
Minneapolis, but how did that impact, or how does that impact the archival resources, abilities, keeping it queer and accessible.
So you're asking, because they're no longer open, how do we get our hands on them and keep it queer?
That, and how did it impact keeping archives through the process?
Okay. So the bookstores themselves are really interesting. One of the projects that Sinister Wisdom is actually doing right now that I've popped in and out of. Sinister Wisdom is a lesbian feminist journal that is still around. It's been operational since '73. And they've been looking through all of the feminist bookstore news editions and making a very, very, very large Excel book documenting all of the books that were discussed in feminist bookstore news. And that's one of the biggest tangible resources that we can really look back at, because bookstores and publishers were both sending lists to feminist bookstore news. It was this really impactful cultural moment for the women in print movement and lesbian feminist presses in general, because it was born out of a desire to be able to talk about the things that they wanted out of books. And I mentioned lesbian pulp, and half of lesbian pulp roughly was written by men writing under women's pseudonyms. And so they were trying to distance themselves from things like that, and created this newsletter that circulated. And so we can look through those and see who was selling what, how much they were being sold for, if they were used or new. Some of them were just classics, some of them were more specific books. And then I think a lot of it becomes a little grassroots cultural project where we were at a bookstore the other day and I picked up a book titled The Lesbian Erotic Dance, and I opened it up and it was from Spinsters Inc. And I was like, no way, that's crazy. Who just left a Spinsters Inc. book lying around? That is another early feminist press. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. A lot of it is going through and looking at things that were being written about what was being published, and then amassing book lists, and then you can search on WorldCat, which is a super fun database. Library Sciences and Archive Space is also these are both digital platforms that give you directions to go and where more traditional archives are housed and whose collections, but that requires it to be cataloged, which neither of these archives are cataloged traditionally. So yeah.
I loved both of your presentations. I think they're extremely timely. I especially liked your call to community solutions to community problems, remembering how to riot, as it were, as a queer community. It's something that makes me think about as a queer academic in a conservative part of the country myself. How do we do as we work towards community solutions, how do we do our daily individual resistances? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As queer academics in these spaces. I'm at a military institute, for example.
Sorry.
Something
you love.
So, I wear a uniform every day. And so my own small individual rebellions are prominently posting every pride flag I can get my hands on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I was curious, what does that mean to you two on the daily basis? In addition to all the community work we do in our publishing and everything else, our teaching, what do those daily affirmations and resistances mean to you two?
I mean, I think that's the kind of the question we're facing. I'm in Louisiana, and Louisiana is always a mess, but it's a particularly messy moment right now. Our governor has ousted I've been there for 2 years, and our governor has ousted at least 3 professors that he didn't like based on what they spoke. He recruits these students to take videos of them, and then he posts them all over X or Twitter, and ousts them. At the same time, we've got several of us on the TPUSA watch list for having pride flags or whatever, and I think that and I talk about this later, one of the solutions I posed to this problem, and that a lot of people gear towards, is like engaging a public politics of obscenity, right? Where they just they just continue to speak obscenely. And I think that, that takes a number of ways, and a number of different forms of speech acts, from the text we sign to what decor we put in our office at the same time, to how we announce ourselves, or what we're willing to say. So I think for myself in my project, in my own work, in highlighting a lot of, obviously I work with obscene materials that are all over court cases, and but I think it's just a commitment to speaking obscenely. And these things may be obscene culturally, right? They're the legal rights of what's obscene today are such a narrow category. So if someone says this book is obscene, it's not actually obscene, of course, but it's got its own cultural category, and like any claim to obscenity has devastating effects, like the archive. So I think for me, it's just a commitment to continuing to speak obscenely, to make these things public, and let the costs be what they may. That's not in my control. I can't help when Jeff Landry is going to come after me because I'm talking about gay porn. So
I think so. I went to Minnesota, is what I did, and
I know, I'm from Michigan.
love the Midwest. And yeah, I grew up there, and then we moved to Florida, and I stayed there and went to Florida State, and then was looking at grad school, and I was like, I'm gonna go. And so I have a unique position there, where in my classes and with my students, I am much more able to discuss queerness in my research, and they come and ask me really sweet and lovely questions and engage with it, and I'm super, super lucky and privileged to be in that position. I had a southern point there though. And then part of it is, at least on my half of the country, I just keep reminding people to look to the South, and look to the grassroots organizations, and look to the people who are teaching in more observed places, so that then when Trump sends the National Guard to Minneapolis, which he's talking about doing in winter, which is crazy, but
Brave.
Then they can look and interrogate that kind of situation, and then outside of that, I call myself a dyke every day, and I will not stop calling myself a dyke every single day. So.
That really resonates with me. But speaking of sanity, referring to ourselves proudly, I talk about my partner in the classroom with my uniformed military cadets every day.
Oh.
You know what I mean? It's
Hell yeah.
refusing to be in the wake of that guy at the FBI getting fired for a pride flag. I was saying to my partner, I'll die on this hill. I'm not letting my pride flags go. It's that's fine, I'll take care of you until you find your next job.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you both very much.
I think we had a question.
I was actually thinking about obscenity laws and how they are and are not the sort of other recent restrictions on expression, right? That in some ways, right, the anti-DEI are statewide and so localized, and obscenity was a federal issue. But obscenity is also narrow, and the anti-DEI is no, you don't exist. Which is not just, you can't say this. And I just want someone who has grappled with these much more and has a lot more knowledge to talk about sort of obscenity versus sort of other restrictions on expression, because there might be something to learn from ways people fought against obscenity laws and made it much more narrow than it used to be.
Yeah. Well, today obscenity law is actually a lot more conservative than it was in the 60s and 50s. What happens in the 70s is that there's this case in 73 called Miller v. California, and it has the Miller test. And it shifts from the idea that a text or a speech act has to have social value to it has to have serious, artistic, political, or aesthetic, I don't know if that's the right three, but I think it is, value. And that shift to the serious has kind of empowered censors' hands it was, especially in the 70s, it's a bit of a losing battle now. But yeah, like what we see now, like with, I mean, speech acts are like, I think about these a lot, and our ability to kind of like, one of the things in my project, here's what I'll say, is the ability to like form classes of people, right? That's like how you move through the legal system. That's how liberalism works, right? If you want to sue the government, you have to make like a class action lawsuit. You have to form yourselves in a position, right? That's the project of liberalism, and all of that relies on the ability for like self-expression, right? You have to be able to say, the law has to allow you to say like, I am gay, right? Like I think of Judith Butler saying, I am woman, right? And so, yeah, like speech acts and like systems of expression are kind of crucial to what the state allows, right? And if the state allows it, right, you're obviously not included in the social, right? So I think the First Amendment is kind of the site where the U.S. builds its social foundation, right? Whether or not you're included in what's protected speech or what's not, right, is whether or not you're kind of how you identify, what expressions you identify with are included or not as well. I mean, as for like the other part of this, that like what's included in obscenity and what's not, I mean, it's a co-opting of obscenity, right? A lot of times what people will say is that like, so we can look at a comic like Genderqueer, which is one of the most banned books. They'll say like, this is obscene, right? Like it's only for prurient interest, right? It appeals to minors, and the federal statute for obscenity towards minors is different. It goes back to the Allen Ginsberg case, not Allen, Ralph, no, yeah, it is Allen. There's two different Ginsberg cases, the Howell case. And yeah, so what we see like is kind of a co-opting of obscenity to push that as like a category of speech when that's not what it actually is. Like these, genderqueer is not obscene legally because it doesn't actually only appeal to prurient interest, right? It has some kind of value attached to it. And so what like is there is just a co-opting, but these definitions of obscenity are still at play, right? Like these are what gets lauded in public discourse. They try to apply these things when they don't fit. So that's what I would say. I hope that answers your question.
I was hoping more on the solution side, but that's utopian. So.
Yeah, I mean, until we have a court that like is interested in expanding what speech acts are, I don't know that there is much. The last real major time that I can think of that something new was legally considered a speech act was in Citizens United, when political support giving political money was rendered a speech act, right? That's kind of why we're in the mess we are now. But there have been attempts at state courts to define some of these things that we're thinking of as speech acts, right? Marriage has been attempted to legally be defined as a speech act, right? Presumably you say I do to a person, they say I do back, right? And in not allowing me to say that, you've restricted my freedom of speech. The same thing has been said about gender identity and like anti-discrimination protections as well. Like this is a speech act, kind of the ability to like not use like whatever preferred pronouns I have would be an attempt to restrict speech. So I think there have been successful attempts. Obscenity in state courts is really different, and it depends on the state. So that's kind of where I'm looking today. But I think one of the ways in which we can appeal better is to the First Amendment than these identity claims. I also think the focusing on act rather than identity is a little more productive in the current landscape of this court, who we've seen is skeptical to any like bioessentialist claim to immutability, which is what all of these equal protections cases are built off. So yeah, we needed a court, but
I just wanted to respond a little bit to what he was saying. Sorry, I can't turn that way. The gentleman teaching at the military institution about pride flags, and you referenced Alachua County, which is where I live. And in Alachua County, Governor DeSantis hates the blue spot. and comes after the school board and the teachers on the regular right now in a obscene way, in my opinion, to change the wording. But there was a teacher at one of the high schools who simply had a pride flag hanging on the side of his podium, and there is this elementary teacher who is mixed, whatever, I don't know, doesn't matter, and they're being dragged. And so responding to that, how do you show up daily? I mean, I poke people on the internet all the time to go into spaces that used to infuriate me, and they still infuriate me, but I poke instead of reacting. I ask them why they don't care about people and how does this hurt them, and why wouldn't you want to be respectful of someone? And that's also daily resistance in a cis straight passing individual, to be able to poke and add to it, but the Kool-Aid is awfully strong.
You should also mention the last artist who was actually charged with and like arrested with obscenity was in a state court in Florida.
Oh, of course. I
A
mean,
lot of these states, like, we have this test federally, but a lot of states have obscenity laws that extend beyond that.
But I think the hard work is worth it. The poking is worth it.
yeah, absolutely.
I had a student reference being bisexual to me the other day, which in a conservative military institute environment is something special.
Right.
For sure.
Definitely. Yeah.
My question is for Rhiannon. I am wondering about, okay, like, you know, Naya Press had these, like, envelope stuffing parties.
Yes.
They had, like, filled them with their like, advertisements and stuff, and, like, people who weren't associated with Naya would come and, like, get pizza and help stuff envelopes and get paid. And I'm wondering how, like, that sort of, like, community, like, activity, if you feel like that functions in the circuit you were talking about, or even as, like, a queer archival practice, like, people are, like, engaging with this, like, institution, they're learning about it, they're, like, interacting with the literal archive, the catalog, and then going and, like, spreading out into all of these places in the US. Do you have that, like, with them? And, well, yes, that's maybe where, like, the importance of queer oral history fits into.
Yeah. I absolutely think that like fits into this. You asked if it like fit into the like the queer archival community practice. Yeah. So